Hi everyone, welcome to April and welcome to week 14 of Winging It. So it's the first week in the month, and as ever we're using a colour prompt. And if you've been following me over on Instagram, you'll have seen that this month's colour scheme is pastel shades. So we're going to be exploring the full rainbow, but in much softer versions of our pure colours. Can I recommend that this month you get hold of a little jar or pot and save all of your thread scraps as you're working, because we're going to be using them later on this month. So I'm going to get my stuff together, gather your threads and your fabrics and your 8x8 panel, and let's get stitching. Okay, so our colour prompt this month is pastels. And so when we're talking about pastels, we're talking about more muted tones, but we can still use the full spectrum. So I've made a little pastel rainbow here, and I would define a pastel colour as a pure colour that has white added. So it's lightened up, but rather than just getting weaker, it gets lightened, if you like. And I've just picked out all of the colours of the rainbow just to illustrate the fact that we can use any colour we like, really, that is a little bit lighter than the purest form of that colour. Before we get on with our project, I thought we could have a look at some design ideas. And when I asked my family what they thought of when they thought about pastel colours, the first thing that came to mind was sweets. And I thought, with the time of year we're in, the sweets that came to mind for me were mini eggs, and I thought this might be quite a fun thing to do, just cut ovals in different pastel colours, either fabric or felt, and then use our knots to add some of the speckles that you see on them. But I wanted to use more of a range of our knots, so this really would rely on French knots, I suppose, and I wanted to take things a little bit further. Another idea that came to mind was the sort of rows of houses that you see at the seaside. I've had many really enjoyable trips to places like Cornwall and some of the coastal parts of Wales, and you see these lovely rows of townhouses that are all painted pastel colours, and I thought this might make a really sweet little scene. But again, I couldn't really see any opportunity to use our knots on this one other than the sort of doorknobs. And although I did really quite like this idea, I did want to play around with our knots. So the design that I landed on is a little bit more graphic and abstract, I suppose. We're comfortably into spring now. The weather's taken a lovely turn here in Lincolnshire. I hope it has for you as well. But we're thinking a lot about life cycles. My daughter was looking for frog spawn in our local pond. Frogs are her favourite animal. It made me think about cycles and the fact that things are starting a new pattern. And so I thought that it might be nice to use a sort of circular motif in this, and we haven't really done anything that's focused on mindfulness, and I really like some of the mandalas that I see on Instagram, some of the stitched mandalas. I thought this was a really good opportunity to play around with all of the stitches we've learned so far. So that's what I'm going to go with this week. So that's where we're heading. So I'm going to work on this lovely peachy colour. I can't remember the name of the colour. This is a Kunin felt that I'm using, and I believe it's in our spring felt rainbow roll. And as you can see, I've already marked in my border, and I've put in the horizontal and vertical intersection. I've also marked in the diagonals because that's going to help me space my stitches around my segments of my circle. And I've just drawn in some concentric circles, and I've just used my circle template for this. I thought you could live without seeing me do that. So I started with the biggest circle, and then I've just worked my way in, and I've left different amounts of space in between the circles as well, so they aren't all regular, but yours could be if you wanted to. And I thought I would start by stitching in the actual circles, and I'm not going to stitch them all in. I don't want a circle everywhere. So some of these colour combinations might look a bit funky to start off with, but hopefully when we've got the full rainbow on there, it's going to look much better. So I think I am going to follow a rainbow. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rings here, and then my centre circle. So green is my 4th colour. Let's put some back stitch. I'm just going to back stitch around here, and then we're going to whip it. And I haven't really planned this fully. I'm just making it up as I'm going along. So you could, I'm not very good at doing things messily, as we've seen in previous videos. So if you wanted to do a messy mandala that's got more irregular circles, there's some great people on Instagram that do messy mandalas, not necessarily in stitch, but in ink and paint as well. So one of my favourites is Robin Mead, who's an artist that I follow on Instagram. She does loads of mandala artwork that I just absolutely love. She works in very bright colours a lot of the time. And another person that does messy mandalas is somebody on Instagram called Design Camp in My Basement. They do lots of slow stitch work and sort of mini quilts, and I just love the things that she does. She works in circles quite a lot. If you're looking for stitched mandalas to inspire you, can I recommend West Coast Stitchery, who has lots of mandala projects that are beginner friendly. So I think she sells on Etsy as well. So I'll put some links to these people at the bottom of the screen and in the description, so you can go and take a look at their work and just get inspired. If you're not sure about whipped stitches, this is something that we looked at in our March stitch tutorial, so I'll put a link to that at the top of the screen, so that if you are joining us for the first time, you can go back and have a look and see how that stitch works. Okay, so let's put in a little bit of blanket stitch, so it's a bit of revision. So what I'm going to do is work my blanket stitch outwards, so the verticals are going to go outside my circle, and they're obviously where my circle is coming close to the edge of my square, the edge of my border. They're going to get a little bit shorter because I don't want to go beyond my border. So some of them are sort of barely there. And this is where I can use those verticals and horizontals and diagonals to help me. So I've got my diagonal here, I've got 7 stitches. So what I want is 7 stitches again out to my next diagonal. And that's going to help me keep my stitches evenly spaced and keep the mandala looking regular, because one of the things that is important in mandalas is that sort of sense of repeating patterns, which is why I think it's such a nice thing to be doing for spring. So you get the idea. I'm going to just pause here, and I'm just going to finish off my circles just with some different whipped and lace stitches, and then we'll come back and start thinking about our knots. Okay, so I'll be back shortly. Okay, so I've got my circles in. So what we're going to start doing now is adding a little bit of interest, because we don't want it to be just circles. I quite like the effect that this Pekingese stitch and the blanket stitch around the edge is having. So I thought we could start at the centre and work our way out. And what I'm going to do is put a little flower at the centre, and I'm going to work a 4-petal lazy daisy. So I've got 2 strands of this lilac thread here, and I'm just going to pop in a petal sort of north, south, east and west. And I'm just using my detached chain stitches. These are in our March video, and again I will put a link at the top of the screen. There we looked at looped stitches in March. So that's where you'll find instructions for the blanket stitch that I put around the edge, as well as these detached chains as well. So we'll put our little daisy at the centre, 4-petal daisy, and then we've got to get some knots in here, haven't we? So what I'm going to do is add a little pistol stitch in the gap in between the petals. So if you haven't seen our April stitch tutorial video, I'll put a link at the top of the screen there so you can hop over, watch that, learn the stitches and then come back. So just very quickly, I'll just let you know what I'm doing. So a pistol stitch is a French knot on the end of a stalk. So I'm going to wrap twice and then take my needle down where I want the knot part of the stitch to fall. So that's on the outside edge of my inner circle there, and that just puts in a little pistol stitch. So I'm just going to put one of those in the spaces in between petals. Okay, so we've got our little daisy in the middle with our pistol stitches in between, and I'm going to use this pastel indigo, if that's not a contradiction, but it's our sort of darker blue. I'm just going to put some French knots, I think, around in that space in here. So we've got our lilac and now we've got our indigo layer. So I'm just going to put a series of French knots, and again I'm going to use my segments that I've marked, the diagonals and horizontals, just to make sure that those stitches are evenly spaced. So again, the instructions for French knots are in our April stitch tutorial video. It's all in there. So twice around and then back through the felt to the back, just to position the knot. If you can see the way that I'm working, I just want these to be evenly spaced. So I'm putting a knot on the horizontal or vertical line, then a knot on the diagonal, and then stitching in the gap. I'm finding this a really therapeutic panel actually, because there's so much repetition, and I think that's part of the point of mandalas. Okay, so I've added in our French knots. So what I thought we could do is have a play with some bullion knots, and I know this might seem scary to some, but what I'm going to do is put some bullions in here, and I thought we could make some arches of bullion knots, and I'm going to work segment by segment, and I think I'm going to try and get 2 arches in each segment. So I'm going to bring my needle up here, and I'm going to take my needle in halfway around that segment and bring it back up. So I've got 2 strands of embroidery thread here, and I'm using a straw needle. So I've got 30 wraps on there, and I don't want them too tight, but I don't want them loose either. So I'm just using my finger to sort of roll those wraps to make sure they're even around the needle, and I think that's going to be enough. So now I'm going to pull my needle through, and I'm just rolling again until my needle gets released. And because I've got more wraps than the distance between the starting point and end point of my stitch, that bullion knot is going to curve around and form a little bit of a loop to make an arch. Now if I want to, I can catch that down with a little stitch over the top. So this time I've brought my needle up at the end of that first loop, and I'm taking it back down on my next segment line. And I know I put 30 wraps on, so I'm going to do the same again for this knot. Okay, so you can see where I'm going with that, and you can just use the eye of your needle to just arrange your loops as you want them. So I'm going to put in the rest of those bullion knots, and then we'll come back and look at the final stages. Okay, so I've put in our little arches there in bullion knots, and I'm thinking that's looking quite cute at the moment. I'm really liking the effect that that creates. I like the texture as well, and the fact that it's sitting a little bit proud of the surface. So we've used some French knots, we've used some bullion knots. I want to do a few more pistol stitches because I really like them, and I think we can make more of that. And so what I'm going to do is, I've got 2 strands of green thread here, and I think I'm going to put a pistol stitch coming out from in between each of my arches, and I'm going to make these as long as the space between the end of those bullion arches and my blue and green whipped layer there. So I'm going to do 3 wraps because I want them to sort of stand out a little bit, and I'm just going to try and make sure that I follow the angle as best as I can. So these are just going to sort of radiate out from my bullion arches, and they're also falling in between my running stitches as well, from that layer of blue running stitches that I put in. I think mandalas really are all about the interplay between patterns and the way patterns interact with each other and fit together. And so you can play around with this as much as you want to. So you can see the way that that's taking shape now. So I'm just going to finish adding in some more knots and layers, and then I'll come back and do the final finishing flourish. Right, so I've added in some yellow and orange. So for the yellow layer I've put in some detached fly stitches, and then in orange I've added in some detached chains, some larger ones inside the V of the fly stitch, and then some tiny ones just where the fly stitches join. So I quite like this texture, and looking at it, I felt like we didn't really have it anywhere else. So what I thought I'd do is add just some beads in, and I just quite like the tactile quality. It seems to fit in with this sort of mindful piece that we're making. So I've just got some different beads in a sort of rainbow, if I just pull them in. So I've got some pastel pink there, and just some orange and yellow and all the way around. So I'm just going to add some of those in, and I'm starting off with some pink ones. I've already put a couple on, and I don't want to totally cover up my Pekingese stitch because I like it. So I'm just putting a bead every now and again. So I'm sort of putting a bead and then leaving 2 loops from a Pekingese stitch, and then adding another bead, and I'll just work my way round. I haven't got that many of these beads, so I hope I've got enough. And you get the idea of what I'm doing there. So I'll put the rest in and come back and show you the finished piece. Okay, so here we have our finished pastel piece. I'm actually really pleased with this one. There were a couple of moments where it went through a sort of awkward teenage phase, but I'm actually really happy with the way it looks when it's finished. And I love the fact that for such a mindful piece, it is so textural and tactile. If I just move it a little bit, hopefully you can see those beats catching the light. Hope you've enjoyed that. Can't wait to see your own mandalas and what you do with the pastel colours prompt, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.